How to Never Get Angry or Bothered Again, Stoic and Jungian Secrets. Imagine reaching a state where no one can disturb your peace, not insults, not chaos, not betrayal. The world keeps spinning, people keep provoking, but inside you absolute stillness. This isn't fantasy. It's what both the ancient Stoics and Carl Jung believed was the highest form of mastery. Not power over others, but power over yourself. Today, you'll discover how the mind that understands itself becomes untouchable, how to never be angry and never be bothered again. Part 1. The Root of Anger. The shadow and the ego's wound. Anger is not an emotion that simply appears out of nowhere. It is not born in the moment someone disrespects us, nor does it truly belong to the situation that seems to provoke it. From the Jungian perspective, anger is the eruption of something much older, much deeper, something buried within the psyche, the shadow. It's the face of an energy that has been suppressed for so long that it now fights for expression. When someone irritates us, it is rarely because of what they did. It is because of what part of us is being mirrored back through their behavior. According to Carl Jung, every human being carries within them a shadow, the part of the personality that contains all the traits we reject, deny, or repress. It's not necessarily evil, it's simply what we don't want to admit about ourselves. For example, a person who prides themselves on being calm and rational often suppresses their aggressive impulses. They push them so far down into the unconscious that when someone confronts or challenges them all, that repressed fire bursts out in an uncontrollable form. Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This single line explains the entire structure of anger. When something bothers you deeply, it is because it resonates with a repressed aspect of your psyche. You're not truly angry at the person, you're angry at what they reveal about you. The ego, which Jung described as the center of consciousness, thrives on maintaining control and consistency. It wants to see itself as good, strong, or in control. But life constantly presents us with experiences that contradict that ideal. Someone cuts us off in traffic. A co-worker questions our competence. A friend ignores a message. These seem like small things, but for the ego they're existential threats. The ego interprets disrespect as danger because it equates self-worth with control. So anger emerges as a defense mechanism, a way to restore power, to reassert dominance, to reclaim the illusion of stability that was momentarily shattered. In this sense, anger is not a moral failure, it's a psychological signal. It shows us exactly where our identity is too rigid, too fragile, or too dependent on external validation. The moment you feel offended, the unconscious is revealing that you still need others to confirm your worth. A Stoic would say, "You can't control what others do, but you can control how you respond." Jung would expand that. You can control how you respond only when you understand who within you is responding. In other words, the work is not merely to suppress anger, it's to recognize who in you feels the need to be angry. Most people live in identification with their persona, the mask they show to the world. When that mask is threatened, they react violently. This reaction isn't strength, it's fear disguised as power. Jung observed that people often project their unwanted qualities onto others. For example, someone who despises arrogance may actually carry unacknowledged pride within themselves. When they encounter arrogance in others, the unconscious projection triggers intense irritation. The Stoics understood this dynamic intuitively. Epictetus said, "When you are offended at any man's fault, turn to yourself and study your own failings. Then you will forget your anger." That is a perfect description of shadow work, before Jung gave it a name. If we merge Stoicism with Jungian psychology, anger becomes a mirror, not a weapon. Every time you feel your blood boil, it is your unconscious whispering, "Look here, there's something unhealed." Anger exposes your attachment to control, to being respected, to being right. The Stoic ideal of tranquility is not the absence of emotion, it is the mastery of emotional projection. The person who never gets angry is not the one who has no emotions, it's the one who has integrated them so completely that no external event can disturb their inner equilibrium. Let's explore the structure of this in more depth. Jung believed that emotional outbursts occur when the unconscious overpowers the conscious ego. The unconscious, full of repressed instincts, has been ignored for so long that it finds a way to express itself, often explosively. For instance, when someone says something insulting and you immediately lash out, it's not a conscious decision. It's an autonomous complex, a cluster of energy in the unconscious that has taken over your behavior. In that moment, you are no longer acting. You are being acted upon. The Stoic aim of equanimity, to never be disturbed by others, is essentially the same as Jung's goal of psychic integration, to make the unconscious conscious so that it no longer controls you. Let's imagine a simple example. Suppose a colleague undermines your opinion during a meeting. You feel a surge of anger. On the surface, you might think, that person disrespected me. But if you observe more closely, you might find that your anger comes from a deeper place, perhaps a childhood memory of not being heard, or a feeling of inadequacy you've spent years covering up. Jung would say that this situation has activated an archetypal wound, a symbolic pattern that repeats across your life until you bring it into awareness. The person triggering you is just a carrier of that pattern. Stoicism would call this moment an opportunity to practice mastery over the self. Jung would call it an opportunity for individuation, the process of integrating your unconscious patterns into conscious awareness. The more you resist seeing your shadow, the more you will encounter it in others. The world becomes your mirror. Jung called this projection the unconscious tendency to attribute to others the traits we deny in ourselves. It's the psychological mechanism that makes certain people unbearable to us. We can tolerate what we've accepted, but we rage against what we've repressed. When someone's arrogance or dishonesty drives you crazy, it's not because those traits are rare, it's because they touch the parts of you that are not fully owned. This is why anger can be such a powerful teacher. It reveals the boundaries of your self-awareness. Now, in Stoicism, anger is seen as a disturbance of reason. Seneca wrote, "Anger, if not restrained, is frequently more hurtful to us than the injury that provokes it." Jung would agree, but he would also add that the solution is not simply to restrain anger, but to understand it. Suppression creates repression. Repression creates projection. Stoicism teaches detachment from passion. Jung teaches transformation of passion. The difference is subtle, but crucial. A Stoic disciplines the mind to remain unshaken. A Jungian integrates the energy behind the emotion and turns it into consciousness. Both paths converge on inner peace, but the route differs: Stoicism through control, Jung through integration. To never get angry or bothered by anyone, you must first understand why anyone can bother you. It's because you've given them psychological power over your identity. When your sense of self depends on how others treat you, your emotions become hostage to their behavior. Jung saw this as a failure of individuation, a sign that you have not yet developed a stable relationship with your inner self. The Stoics called it slavery of the mind, being enslaved to externals. Both agree that true freedom is internal. You're free when no one's behavior can define your peace. When we explore anger from a depth, psychological point of view, we see that it's deeply tied to the ego's need for validation. The ego wants to be acknowledged, respected, and seen as right. When that desire is denied, anger erupts to reassert its importance. This is why humility is such a powerful antidote to anger. It disarms the ego. The Stoics practiced memento mori, remembering death to remind themselves how trivial most insults are in the grand scheme of life. Jung would call that confronting the reality of the self, recognizing that the ego is a temporary construct in a much larger psychic field. Once you realize that being offended becomes almost absurd. Why should a momentary insult from another human disturb a soul that spans eternity? But we're not machines. We can't simply tell ourselves not to feel. The Stoics never meant to erase emotion. They meant to train perception. They taught that emotions arise not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. If someone calls you a fool, the insult only hurts if you believe it. Jung would say if you're wounded by that word, it means some part of you fears it might be true. The insult touched an unhealed complex. The way to transcend anger is not by denying it, but by tracing it back to its root, the inner voice that says, maybe I'm not enough. Once you heal that voice, the external provocation loses its grip. In Jungian therapy, the goal is not to eliminate negative emotions, but to decode them. Anger, like pain, is information. It shows you where your boundaries have been crossed, or where your ego has created a boundary that's unnecessary. When you feel anger, ask, what am I protecting? Sometimes it's your dignity. Sometimes it's your pride. Sometimes it's your wound. Stoicism advises you to pause and observe. Jung advises you to explore and integrate. The fusion of both creates psychological mastery. Observation without understanding is repression. Understanding without observation is indulgence. Together they form emotional intelligence. Let's take an example of projection. Imagine someone criticizes you online. You immediately feel a rush of irritation. You want to defend yourself, to correct them, to prove your worth. But if you pause just for a second and watch the emotion, you'll notice something remarkable. The anger isn't about them. It's about your need to be seen as good. The critic simply touched your self-image. The Stoic would say, you have control over your perception, not their words. Jung would say, you're reacting to your own unconscious ideal of perfection. Once you realize that the anger dissolves into awareness, you see that it was never about the other person at all. This is where the work becomes truly spiritual. Both Stoicism and Jungian depth psychology lead toward transcendence, the state where nothing external can disturb your inner equilibrium. But this transcendence doesn't mean detachment from life. It means deeper engagement. You don't avoid people. You simply stop letting them define your emotional weather. Jung described individuation as becoming whole, embracing light and shadow, conscious and unconscious. When you're whole, insults bounce off because they find no crack to enter. You can't be offended by what you've already accepted in yourself. Anger also hides fear. Beneath the surface of outrage lies vulnerability, the fear of being powerless, insignificant, or unseen. Jung often found that patients who struggled with chronic anger were compensating for deep feelings of inadequacy. The ego inflates itself with fury to avoid confronting its own smallness. This is what Jung called inflation, when the ego identifies with the power of an archetype, the warrior, the hero, the avenger, to cover its insecurity. Stoicism recognized this too. Epictetus warned against being carried away by passion, reminding his students that anger is a sign of weakness, not strength. True strength lies in composure, because composure comes from alignment with truth, not illusion. We also need to understand the biological layer of anger from a Jungian lens. The psyche isn't separate from the body. The fight or flight response is deeply archetypal, an ancient mechanism meant to protect us. But in modern life, that energy often has nowhere to go. The body feels disrespected words as if they were physical attacks. That's why Stoic breathing exercises and mindful observation are so effective. They allow the nervous system to calm down, giving consciousness the space to intervene before the unconscious takes over. Jung would call this process making the unconscious conscious, reclaiming the instinct and giving it form through awareness rather than reaction. In real life, learning to never be bothered by anyone doesn't mean you'll never feel irritation again. It means you'll recognize it as a psychic message rather than an external assault. For example, when someone acts arrogantly, you might feel an impulse to put them in their place. But if you reflect, you might see that their arrogance touches your own desire to be superior. The mirror becomes visible. Once you see that the emotion transforms, what used to bother you becomes an opportunity for insight. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's the truth behind anger. We think people make us angry, but in reality we're being driven by our own unseen complexes. In essence, anger is the psyche's cry for wholeness. It's the voice of the exiled part of yourself asking to be acknowledged. The more you deny it, the louder it becomes. That's why suppression never works. Stoicism teaches discipline, but Jung would warn that over-discipline without integration leads to emotional numbness, a false calm. True serenity isn't deadness, it's dynamic balance. It's the ability to feel the full force of emotion without being enslaved by it. That requires courage, honesty, and self-awareness. The first step to achieving this balance is observation. When you feel anger, don't act, don't justify, and don't suppress. Just watch, name it, feel where it lives in your body. Jung often said that emotions are the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. They carry messages from the depths. If you sit with them long enough, they reveal their origin. Maybe your anger is rooted in an unmet need for respect. Maybe it's inherited part of a family pattern passed down unconsciously. Whatever its source, bringing it to light dissolves its power. The Stoics practiced this too. They reviewed their emotional responses daily, asking themselves which were useful and which were destructive. Reflection was their form of therapy. In Jungian terms, this process is the confrontation with the shadow, the courageous act of seeing your own darkness without judgment. Every time you resist blaming others and instead ask, what part of me is this showing me, you integrate another fragment of your soul. Over time, you become less reactive, not because the world changes, but because you've grown larger inside. The insults that once wounded now teach. The chaos that once disturbed now reveals. You begin to live as both Jung and the Stoics, envisioned in harmony with your inner self, calm, centered, and unbothered. Part 2: Detachment and Inner Freedom. The Stoic practice of observation. Detachment is not coldness and indifference is not peace. To detach in the Stoic and Jungian sense means to live with full awareness, yet without identification. It is the art of watching the storm within you, without becoming the storm itself. In Jungian terms, detachment is the movement from ego to self, the shift from the narrow reactive consciousness that identifies with every emotional impulse to the wider observing awareness that sees emotions as waves moving across the ocean of the psyche. Stoicism and depth psychology both aim at this same mastery, to remain inwardly still amid the chaos of the outer world. For the Stoics, observation is the highest discipline. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." That line could easily have come from Jung's Red Book. The inner world is the battlefield. The enemy is not other people, but our identification with passing mental states, anger, fear, jealousy, or pride. Jung would say consciousness is not meant to suppress emotion, but to contain it. To contain in Jung's language means to hold the tension without acting it out or repressing it. Stoics practice this same containment through reasoned self-reflection and radical acceptance of fate. They train themselves to witness their impulses as if from a distance, recognizing that anger and disturbance arise not from reality itself, but from the stories the mind attaches to it. From a depth psychological point of view, this act of witnessing is transformative. The moment you observe a thought or emotion, you step out of identification with it. This is the difference between saying I am angry and I feel anger arising within me. The first statement fuses identity with emotion. The second acknowledges emotion as a temporary phenomenon within consciousness. Jung's entire model of individuation rests on this ability to separate the observing self from the reacting ego. When you can see your thoughts and feelings as objects within awareness, you become the subject, the conscious center. That shift is the essence of detachment. But detachment doesn't come naturally. The ego is addicted to control, and anger is one of its favorite tools. When we feel offended or disrespected, the ego rushes to defend its boundaries. It wants to punish the one who caused discomfort. Yet paradoxically, the more we react, the more power we give away. The Stoics understood this deeply. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Jung would reinterpret this psychologically. The event itself is neutral. What hurts is the archetypal meaning we unconsciously project onto it. When someone humiliates you, you don't suffer from their words, you suffer from the activation of the wounded child or inferior function within you. Observation breaks this chain. It allows you to feel without being possessed by the feeling. To practice this form of detachment, you must first slow down the automatic link between stimulus and reaction. The modern person is conditioned to react instantly. A comment online, a tone of voice, a look, and the emotional body ignites. But between stimulus and response, there exists a sacred space. Viktor Frankl, who drew heavily from both Stoicism and depth psychology, said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response." Jung would describe that space as the realm of consciousness, the place where the self observes the ego. Stoic detachment is the discipline of living in that space. In Jungian therapy, clients are often asked to observe their emotions as if they belong to someone else. This is not denial, it's conscious separation. For example, instead of saying, "I'm furious at my partner," one might say, "There's a strong wave of fury moving through me right now." That linguistic shift rewires the psyche. You're no longer the fury, you're the witness of it. Stoicism trained this witness through daily reflection. Marcus Aurelius began and ended each day by examining his thoughts and actions, asking where he had been reactive, where he had remained composed, and what stories he had told himself. This ritualized observation mirrors Jung's concept of active imagination, the inner dialogue between the conscious ego and the unconscious contents that arise in dreams, fantasies, or emotions. Both practices aim to expand awareness until no emotion can fully possess you. To understand the psychology behind this, we need to examine how projection works. Jung taught that we are constantly projecting inner content onto the outer world. When you admire someone, you're projecting your own latent potential onto them. When you despise someone, you're projecting your disowned traits. In either case, you're reacting to yourself, not to reality. The Stoics grasped this intuitively. They warned against judging others because judgment reveals ignorance of the self. When Epictetus said, "When someone is angry with you, know that it is their opinion," he was speaking psychologically. Each person lives inside their own projections. Detachment then means pulling your projections back. It means realizing that what irritates you in others is a mirror of what you haven't yet understood in yourself. This level of awareness requires tremendous humility. The ego doesn't like being seen through. It wants to believe that others truly are the cause of its feelings. But the moment you admit, "I am disturbed because of how I interpret this event," you reclaim responsibility. Jung often compared this to withdrawing projections during individuation. At first, it feels like losing something. You lose the ability to blame, to feel righteous, to enjoy the drama. But soon you discover a deeper power, the freedom to remain undisturbed no matter what happens. That is Stoic serenity, and it's born not from coldness, but from psychological maturity. Observation also changes the biology of emotion. Neuroscience confirms what ancient Stoics practiced: awareness rewires the brain. When you observe an emotion instead of reacting, you engage the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason and reflection, instead of the amygdala, which triggers fight or flight. Jung might have called this psychic regulation, where consciousness holds the instinct instead of being consumed by it. The Stoics trained this regulation through deliberate pauses. They would remind themselves that insult, loss, or pain are merely interpretations, not realities. The same event can be tragedy or comedy depending on the mind observing it. Jung would call this transcendent function the capacity to hold opposites, pain and peace, anger and understanding, until a higher synthesis emerges. The more you practice this, the less life can throw you off balance. However, detachment must never become dissociation. Jung warned that spiritual detachment can turn into spiritual bypassing, using higher understanding to avoid feeling. True observation requires feeling fully and consciously. The Stoics were often misunderstood as suppressors of emotion, but that's not accurate. They didn't deny emotion, they denied enslavement to emotion. Marcus Aurelius still felt grief, fear, and frustration, but he viewed them from above as natural human experiences within a cosmic order. Jung would call this the perspective of the self, the inner center that holds all opposites in harmony. From that altitude, you can observe the play of your own psyche with compassion instead of judgment. You can say, "Ah, here comes my pride," or "There goes my need to control," with the same calm curiosity a scientist would apply to an experiment. In daily life, Stoic observation looks deceptively simple. Someone criticizes you, and instead of snapping back, you take a breath. You feel the initial surge, heat in the chest, tension in the jaw, and you name it silently: anger, pride, hurt. Then you ask, what story is my mind telling right now? Maybe it's, they don't respect me, or I'm being humiliated. Then comes the Stoic insight. Is that story objectively true or merely an interpretation? The instant you question the narrative, you disarm the emotion. Jung described this as creating a symbolic attitude, turning the literal emotional reaction into symbolic material for inner work. The insult becomes an archetypal drama, not a personal one. You become both actor and observer, aware that the real stage is inside your psyche. This level of inner freedom was the goal of individuation. Jung believed that mature consciousness can hold emotions without being devoured by them. The immature psyche either represses or explodes. The mature psyche reflects. Stoicism taught this same middle path, neither indulgence nor avoidance, but mastery. To remain calm in provocation is not repression, it's awareness. When you observe your reaction without acting on it, the emotion completes its natural cycle and dissolves. What fuels anger is not the initial spark, but the story that keeps replaying it. The Stoics cut the story, Jung transformed it. Either way, peace returns. A central exercise in Stoic training was premeditatio malorum, imagining adversity before it occurs. They would visualize insult, loss, betrayal, and even death, not to become pessimistic but to build psychological immunity. By rehearsing disturbance in the mind, they weakened its grip on the heart. Jung did something similar with active imagination. He would enter into dialogue with his fears and shadow images, facing them until they lost power. Both methods rest on the same principle: what you face consciously can no longer dominate you unconsciously. Detachment is not escape, it's intimacy without possession. To live like this, one must cultivate constant self-awareness. The Stoics called it prosoche, continual attention to the present moment. Jung called it consciousness. When you observe your thoughts throughout the day, the small irritations, the flashes of envy, the judgments, you begin to see patterns. Those patterns are the architecture of your shadow. For instance, if you notice that arrogance in others always provokes you, that's your projection. If you see that disrespect triggers rage, perhaps you're still carrying the voice of an inner critic who once made you feel small. Each observation is a thread leading back to your own psyche. Follow it, and you will discover that no one truly disturbs your peace but you. This realization can be unsettling at first. It means taking radical responsibility for every emotional reaction. The ego resists this because it thrives on the illusion that others are to blame. But once you see that irritation is self-generated, you also realize something empowering: peace is self-generated too. You don't need the world to change to be calm. You only need to see clearly. This clarity, this moment-to-moment witnessing, is the Stoic art of living and the Jungian path of individuation. Both lead to inner freedom, the state where nothing external dictates your inner state. Let's explore an example. Imagine a friend cancels plans last minute. Instantly your mind spins: they don't value me, I'm always the one who cares more. These thoughts generate hurt and anger. A Stoic pause here is transformative. You observe the thought as a thought. You see that your interpretation, not their cancellation, creates the pain. Jung would encourage you to ask what archetype is being triggered, perhaps the abandoned child, perhaps the people-pleaser. Instead of reacting, you watch the emotional energy rise, peak, and fade. In doing so, you integrate a small piece of the shadow, the part that fears rejection. Each time you observe instead of react, you dissolve another knot of unconscious pain. Over time, life's disturbances become material for growth instead of suffering. Observation also nurtures compassion. When you understand that everyone is acting from their own unconscious complexes, anger turns into empathy. Jung noted that most conflicts are collisions of unconsciousness. The Stoics said the same people act out of ignorance, not malice. When someone wrongs you, you can respond with the calm understanding that they are slaves to their passions just as you once were. This doesn't mean tolerating injustice. It means not losing yourself to it. The Stoic sage and the individuated person share this quality. They respond with clarity, not compulsion. It's important to emphasize that observation is a discipline, not a mood. You don't wait until you feel calm to observe. You observe because you feel disturbed. That is the crucible where awareness is forged. Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Stoic practice proves the same discomfort is the teacher. Each time you face irritation with awareness, you strengthen the muscle of equanimity. Slowly, the gap between trigger and reaction widens. What used to throw you into rage now merely passes through you like a gust of wind. You begin to live in what the Stoics called apatheia, freedom from irrational passion, and what Jung called alignment with the self. As observation deepens, you notice something profound. Emotions lose their solidity. Anger, fear, jealousy, they become transparent like clouds passing across the sky. You see them as movements of psychic energy, not as facts. Jung often described this in symbolic language. The ego, he said, is like a small island, surrounded by the vast ocean of the unconscious. When waves of emotion crash against it, the ego panics, thinking the island will disappear. But when consciousness expands, when you identify with the ocean rather than the island, the waves lose their threat. The Stoics lived from that same oceanic awareness. To them, life's events were waves of fate. You can't stop the sea, but you can learn to surf it. Detachment, therefore, is not emotional numbness, but emotional transparency. It's the difference between a window covered in dust and one that's clean. The light passes through either way, but only the clean window lets you see clearly. When you practice observation, you clean the window of perception. Every act of self-awareness wipes away a little distortion. Over time, you begin to experience life directly without the filters of egoic drama. This is what both Jung and the Stoics meant by inner freedom, not the absence of emotion, but the absence of distortion. Still, we must remember that detachment is an ongoing practice. The ego will always try to pull you back into identification. Even Jung admitted that he never achieved perfect detachment. He called it a lifelong dialogue between the conscious and unconscious. The Stoics said the same. Only the sage is perfectly free, and no one is fully a sage. But progress matters more than perfection. Each moment of awareness, each small victory over reactivity, expands the realm of freedom within you. To cultivate this, you can use practical Stoic Jungian exercises. 1. Pause before reaction. When emotion arises, breathe. Observe where it manifests in your body. Feel it without naming it right away. This is containment. 2. Name the emotion. Quietly identify what you feel. Naming separates observer from observed. This is irritation. This is fear. Jung called this differentiating consciousness. 3. Question the story. Ask what thought fuels the emotion. They disrespected me, I'm not enough. Realize these are narratives, not truths. 4. Trace the root. Look inward. What memory or belief does this touch? What part of you feels threatened? This is shadow work. 5. Return to the present. Release the story and anchor in the now. Feel your breath, your body, the simplicity of being. That's Stoic presence. Practice daily, this sequence rewires the psyche. You become the calm center around which emotions circulate without chaos. You stop being a victim of circumstances and become the conscious participant of your inner evolution. Jung would say you've begun to individuate. The Stoics would say you've begun to live according to nature, rationally, peacefully aligned with the Logos. Over time, observation changes your relationships as well. When you no longer take offense easily, people's behavior stops controlling your mood. You become immune to manipulation because you see through emotional contagion. Jung noted that unintegrated people unconsciously provoke reactions in others to carry their shadow. A calm observer cannot be used this way. The Stoics describe the same strength. The sage cannot be insulted because he doesn't depend on approval. This doesn't make you detached from love or compassion. It makes your love purer because it's no longer mixed with need. You help others not from emotional reaction but from clarity. Even suffering becomes different under observation. Jung said that suffering ceases to be suffering when it finds meaning. Stoic observation turns pain into understanding. When life tests you, you can either resist or observe. Resistance creates resentment. Observation creates wisdom. Every challenge becomes material for growth. The very people who once bothered you become mirrors of your inner evolution. The less you react, the more you see. The more you see, the freer you become. Ultimately, the Stoic practice of observation and Jungian detachment lead to the same discovery: you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not even your ego. You are the awareness in which they arise. That awareness, the self in Jung's terms, the logos in Stoic terms, is unshakable. When you live from that center, no insult can wound, no chaos can disturb. The world remains the same, but your perception transforms. You walk through life as witness and participant, fully engaged yet never enslaved. That is inner freedom, the quiet strength that neither anger nor fear can touch. Part 3. Emotional Alchemy. Transforming the shadow into wisdom. Transformation begins at the point where resistance ends. Both Jung and the Stoics understood that the energy of our emotions, especially anger, is not meant to be suppressed but transmuted. Suppression only buries the energy deeper into the unconscious, where it festers and becomes destructive. Transformation, however, means using that same energy as material for growth. It is psychological alchemy, turning the base metal of human reactivity into the gold of consciousness. Carl Jung often referred to emotional transformation as the alchemical process of individuation. In medieval alchemy, the goal was to transmute lead into gold. Psychologically, the lead represents the raw instincts, impulses, and wounds hidden in the unconscious, what Jung called the shadow. Gold symbolizes consciousness, wisdom, and integration. Stoicism, while not using the language of alchemy, pursued a similar ideal through reason to refine one's emotions until they no longer enslave the mind. The Stoic sage and the individuated self are the same archetype, the human being who has integrated their inner chaos into order. To understand this process, we must first recognize that emotions are energy in motion. They carry information from the depths of the psyche to the surface of consciousness. Anger, jealousy, envy, fear, none are enemies. They are messengers. The problem arises when the ego, threatened by the discomfort of these emotions, tries to silence them through denial or moral condemnation. Stoicism warns against being ruled by emotion, but it never teaches hatred of emotion. Likewise, Jung warns that what we repress will eventually possess us. Therefore, transformation begins not by fighting the emotion, but by meeting it with awareness. Let's take anger as an example, since it is often seen as incompatible with serenity. In Jungian terms, anger contains immense psychic energy. It is a signal of boundaries, injustice, or wounded pride. When anger arises, it announces that something in your psyche demands recognition. Stoicism teaches us to pause, to refrain from immediate reaction. Jungian psychology teaches us to listen. What is this anger trying to say? What does it reveal about my values, my attachments, or my fears? Through observation, the energy of anger moves from being destructive to constructive. It becomes fuel for understanding. This act of turning emotion into understanding is what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. The opposites are instinct and awareness, passion and reason, unconscious and conscious. Most people try to resolve this tension too quickly by repressing the uncomfortable side. Stoics would say they seek tranquility by denying passion. Emotional people seek relief by indulging it. Both miss the transformation that comes from enduring the discomfort consciously. When you hold the feeling in awareness without acting or escaping, something begins to change within. The raw energy of emotion reorganizes itself into insight. That is emotional alchemy. Consider a moment of humiliation. Your ego flares up, defending itself, ready to strike back. If you act impulsively, you externalize the energy. If you suppress it, you internalize resentment. But if you simply observe, if you allow the burning sensation of shame and anger to exist without resistance, you create a crucible inside your consciousness. The heat of the emotion melts the rigid structure of the ego. What emerges from that melting is humility, wisdom, and an expanded sense of self. Jung saw this process as essential to psychological maturity. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The Stoics would call this the purification of judgment. To transform emotion is not to change its nature, but its level. The same energy that fuels anger can fuel clarity once it is brought into consciousness. Jung often described the unconscious as a storehouse of potential. Within the shadow lie not only destructive tendencies, but also creativity, strength, and authenticity. The anger you repress might hide your capacity for assertion. The envy you deny might conceal your yearning for self-expression. The fear you avoid might point toward a path of growth. Emotional alchemy means liberating this trapped energy from distortion. The Stoics approached this rationally by redefining emotions as misjudgments. Jung approached it symbolically by integrating them as parts of the whole self. Both lead to mastery. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." Jung would agree psychological gold is forged in the furnace of difficulty. Every emotional disturbance is a small death of the ego, and therefore a chance for rebirth. When you endure emotion consciously, you strengthen the bridge between the unconscious and the conscious. You no longer see emotion as a problem, but as a process. You begin to trust the psyche's intelligence. The Stoics trusted Logos, the rational order of the universe. Jung trusted the self, the organizing center of the psyche. Both recognized that beneath apparent chaos lies purpose. In practical terms, emotional alchemy begins with awareness without interpretation. When an emotion arises, resist the urge to explain it. The mind's first impulse is to create a story. He insulted me. She betrayed me. Life is unfair. These narratives divert attention from the actual experience. Instead, turn inward. What does the emotion feel like in the body? Where does it live in the chest, stomach, throat? Awareness grounds the energy in presence. The Stoics practiced this through reflection. Jung called it confrontation with the unconscious. You become the alchemist who watches the fire without panic, knowing that the fire itself is purifying. The next step is symbolic understanding. Every emotion has symbolic meaning. For instance, anger might symbolize the archetype of the warrior, the drive to defend one's dignity or boundaries. Fear might symbolize the child archetype seeking safety. Jealousy may reveal the lover archetype craving connection. By recognizing the archetypal layer, you detach from the personal story and engage the universal meaning. The Stoics did this intellectually by appealing to reason. Jung did it through imagination and myth. Both methods elevate emotion from instinct to insight. Once you perceive an emotion symbolically, it no longer enslaves you, it educates you. A person who practices emotional alchemy becomes psychologically resilient. They no longer fear inner conflict because they understand that tension is creative. Jung said that the psyche seeks balance, and what we experience as turmoil is often the process of restoring that balance. Stoics expressed this through the idea of amor fati, love of fate. To love fate means to accept every experience, pleasant or painful, as necessary for the unfolding of wisdom. When anger arises, it's not a failure but a teacher. When sadness comes, it's not weakness but integration. Each emotion is an ingredient in the alchemical work of becoming whole. it's important to clarify that transformation is not about moral perfection. Stoicism sometimes risks being interpreted as emotional austerity, the idea that a wise person never feels passion. Jung's psychology corrects this by emphasizing wholeness, not virtue. Wholeness includes opposites, light and dark, calm and rage, reason and desire. To transform emotion, you must first accept its presence as part of your humanity. The Stoic practice of indifference, viewing external events as neither good nor bad, parallels Jung's call for non-judgmental observation. The alchemist does not despise lead, he works with it. Likewise, the wise person does not condemn anger, they refine it. Let's explore a concrete example. Suppose you feel envy toward a friend's success. The ego interprets this as shameful or negative, so you suppress it. But beneath envy lies desire, a longing to actualize your own potential. Jung would ask you to engage the feeling, to imagine what part of you is yearning for recognition. The Stoic would ask you to reframe the judgment. Your friend's success is not a threat, but evidence of possibility. In both approaches, the emotion transforms. Envy becomes inspiration. Bitterness becomes motivation. What was once poison becomes medicine. Another example, you're betrayed by someone you trusted. The immediate response is anger and pain. The Stoic discipline would have you remember that betrayal is beyond your control, but your response is not. Jungian reflection would have you explore what in you feels broken. Perhaps the archetype of the loyal friend. Perhaps the inner child who believed in permanence. When you understand the inner meaning of the experience, the pain turns into knowledge. You see not only the other person's weakness, but your own attachment. That insight is gold, the essence of emotional alchemy. This transformation also changes your relationship with suffering itself. Most people view suffering as meaningless. The Stoics saw it as the forge of character. Jung saw it as the engine of individuation. Both understood that to live without suffering is to live without depth. Suffering brings unconscious material to the surface. When we suffer consciously, that is when we observe and reflect rather than resist, the soul expands. Stoic endurance becomes Jungian integration. The outer pain awakens inner strength. Emotional alchemy also involves integration of the shadow. Jung's central insight was that every person carries within them all human potentials, cruelty, as well as compassion, pride, as well as humility. When we deny these potentials, they become autonomous forces in the unconscious. They erupt as projection, addiction, or rage. Stoicism addressed this indirectly through virtue ethics, controlling impulses, mastering desires. Jung went further. He taught that you must meet the shadow face to face. Instead of striving to be purely good, strive to be whole. The act of admitting your capacity for anger paradoxically reduces its power. The moment you say, "Yes, I too am capable of this," the shadow becomes integrated. The energy that was once destructive now serves consciousness. To integrate anger, you must learn to express it symbolically, not literally. Stoics practiced this through restraint, Jungians through creative imagination. Writing, painting, reflection, these are modern forms of alchemy. When you translate raw emotion into symbol, you lift it from the realm of instinct to meaning. For instance, if you feel rage toward injustice instead of violent reaction, you might channel that energy into writing, teaching, or activism. Jung saw this in artists who turned their inner conflicts into beauty. The Stoics saw it in moral exemplars who transformed personal pain into service to humanity. The principle is the same: emotion becomes wisdom when directed consciously. Jung's model of transformation also includes the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to reconcile opposites by generating a new level of understanding. When you hold your anger in awareness without repression or expression, the psyche produces a third state, calm insight. This is not compromise, it's synthesis. The Stoics called this reason in harmony with nature, when rationality aligns with emotional truth. The transcendent function is the psychological mechanism behind Stoic serenity. It's what happens when awareness becomes so spacious that no emotion can dominate it. The goal of emotional alchemy is not to eliminate reaction but to refine it. The refined mind still feels anger, but now anger becomes discernment, the ability to see clearly what is right or wrong without hostility. The refined heart still feels pain, but pain becomes compassion, the understanding that all beings struggle with their own unconsciousness. The Stoics called this oikeiosis, the sense of kinship with all humanity. Jung would call it individuation, realizing that the self includes everything. When you see that your shadow and others' shadows are made of the same substance, forgiveness arises naturally. The energy that once burned as anger now shines as wisdom. In this way, every emotion contains its opposite. Fear contains courage, anger contains clarity, sadness contains love. The alchemical task is to separate, purify, and reunite these opposites. The Stoics approached this through logic, identifying irrational beliefs and replacing them with rational ones. Jung approached it through inner dialogue, listening to the voice of the emotion until it reveals its truth. Both methods lead to transformation because they bring unconscious content into awareness. Once you know why you feel something, you no longer have to be ruled by it. To practice emotional alchemy, daily cultivate 3 habits. 1. Awareness of projection. Whenever someone triggers you, ask, "What does this reflect about me?" This question withdraws energy from blame and redirects it toward insight. The Stoics called this examining impressions. Jung called it shadow work. 2. Reflection instead of reaction. Before expressing emotion, write about it. Analyze it logically as the Stoics did, or symbolically as Jung did. Ask what it wants from you. Often the emotion itself reveals the next step of growth. 3. Meaning making. Find the meaning behind discomfort. Stoics found meaning in virtue and reason. Jung found it in individuation. Either way, meaning turns pain into purpose. The moment you understand why an experience exists, it ceases to be suffering. Over time, these practices create an internal philosopher-alchemist, a consciousness that neither denies nor indulges emotion but transforms it. You begin to live as a participant in your own evolution. Life ceases to feel random because every emotional storm becomes raw material for wisdom. Jung described this as moving from fate to freedom. The Stoics described it as aligning with the divine order. Both point to the same truth. Mastery of self is mastery of life. Emotional alchemy also deepens your empathy. Once you've seen your own darkness and survived it, you no longer judge others for theirs. You understand that most people act unconsciously, driven by their own unintegrated shadows. This understanding does not make you passive, it makes you compassionate. You can set boundaries without hatred, correct without contempt, and love without attachment. The Stoics believed in sympathia, the interconnectedness of all things. Jung believed in the collective unconscious, the shared field of human experience. When you transform your emotion, you contribute to the healing of this collective field. Your personal work becomes universal service. The final stage of transformation is equanimity, the state in which no experience is wasted. Every joy, every insult, every loss becomes part of your psychological ecosystem. Jung saw this as the emergence of the self, the totality that includes all opposites. The Stoics called it living according to nature, flowing with the universe instead of resisting it. In this state, anger no longer feels like fire, but like light energy that illuminates rather than destroys. Emotional alchemy has completed its work. The lead of reactivity has become the gold of wisdom. The process never ends. Each day brings new emotions, new shadows, new chances to practice. But each act of transformation deepens the mind's serenity. You begin to see life not as a series of problems to fix, but as a field of symbols to understand. This is the philosopher's stone of Stoicism and Jungian depth psychology, the realization that nothing within you is an enemy once it is understood. The shadow becomes your teacher, and emotion becomes your guide. Part 4. The Stoic Jungian Mindset, Unshakable Peace in a Chaotic World. The human mind has always sought one enduring aspiration, peace that cannot be taken away. Both Stoicism and Jungian psychology recognize that this peace cannot be achieved through external control, but only through inner transformation. Chaos in this framework is not an external condition to be eliminated, but an internal state to be integrated. The Stoic Jungian mindset arises when the individual no longer depends on circumstances for stability because they have found equilibrium within the totality of the psyche. From the Stoic perspective, the essence of peace is ataraxia, a state of tranquility born from mastery of perception. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." Jung would agree, but he would extend the definition: the quality of your thoughts depends upon the level of integration within your psyche. The mind that is fragmented, ruled by unconscious forces, cannot experience peace, no matter how disciplined its reasoning. The mind that is whole, that has reconciled shadow and light, ego, and self, no longer needs control. Peace emerges naturally as the equilibrium of opposites. In Stoicism, the source of disturbance lies in false judgment, mistaking externals for internals, and confusing control with attachment. For Jung, disturbance arises when unconscious contents overwhelm consciousness, when the individual identifies with only part of themselves and represses the rest. In both systems, suffering comes from misidentification. The Stoic identifies with possessions, reputation, or bodily comfort. The unintegrated person identifies with their ego, emotions, or persona. In both cases, the cure is awareness. To the Stoic, awareness of reason aligns the self with nature. To Jung, awareness of the unconscious aligns the ego with the self. The result is identical inner freedom. Peace, then, is not passivity. It is dynamic balance. Jung emphasized that psychic health does not mean the absence of tension, but the capacity to hold tension consciously. Similarly, the Stoics did not seek a life without adversity, but a mind unshaken by it. When Marcus Aurelius faced war, betrayal, and death, his composure was not indifference, it was mastery of attention. He saw every event as an expression of universal reason, logos, and thus beyond personal offense. Jung described this same perception as the experience of the self, the realization that every event, including inner conflict, participates in a larger order of meaning. When one lives from that center, peace is not something practiced, it is something that simply is. The Stoic Jungian mindset understands that the outer world mirrors the inner. What we call chaos in life is often the projection of our own unintegrated psyche. Jung taught that the world we perceive is filtered through complexes, emotionally charged clusters of experience that distort perception. The Stoics centuries earlier had already identified this distortion in their doctrine of impressions phantasiae. They warned that we must distinguish between what appears and what truly is. The untrained mind confuses subjective interpretation with objective reality. The wise mind perceives the difference. Jung would call this the movement from projection to perception. The moment we realize that chaos outside is amplified by chaos within, we reclaim power. From this standpoint, peace is not a reward for control, but the consequence of understanding. The Stoics said that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness because virtue aligns the mind with reality. Jung would translate that into psychological language. Integration brings peace because it aligns consciousness with the totality of the psyche. Both describe the same truth through different vocabularies: reason and self, logos, and unconscious order, virtue and wholeness. To live by this mindset is to realize that no external event can truly harm you unless it destroys your inner coherence. And once the ego recognizes that it is only one part of a greater whole, even loss becomes bearable. The first foundation of unshakable peace is self-knowledge. The Stoics practiced continual self-examination. They reviewed each day's actions, identifying where they had been swayed by passion or delusion. Jung insisted that self-knowledge is not intellectual but experiential. It arises from confrontation with one's own shadow. To know yourself is to know not only your ideals but your contradictions. The Stoic calls this rational honesty. Jung calls it individuation. In both cases, peace begins with truth. You cannot be tranquil while deceiving yourself, because lies create inner division. To see yourself clearly without exaggeration or denial is to bring the unconscious into harmony with consciousness. That harmony is the soil in which serenity grows. The second foundation is acceptance of limitation. The Stoics divided existence into what depends on us and what does not. They insisted that our suffering comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. Jung saw the same pattern in the ego's relationship to the unconscious. The ego suffers when it resists the forces of life that transcend it: instinct, fate, time, death. Peace arises when the ego surrenders to the self, just as the Stoic surrenders to nature. This is not fatalism but realism. The mature individual acts with full effort, but without attachment to results. They understand that control is an illusion maintained by fear. The Stoic calls this living according to nature. Jung calls it alignment with the inner archetype of wholeness. Both are paths of surrender through understanding. The third foundation is equanimity toward opposites. Jung observed that the psyche is composed of polarities: joy and sorrow, creation and destruction, love and hate. The ego prefers one pole and represses the other, producing imbalance. The Stoics recognized the same tendency: the human desire for pleasure and aversion to pain. They taught that virtue lies in indifference to both, since both are part of nature's order. Jung reframed this as integration, the conscious acceptance of both sides of reality. The moment you cease judging experience as good or bad, you enter a deeper dimension of awareness. You see that opposites define each other, that joy cannot exist without sorrow, and peace without disturbance is meaningless. The Stoic endures opposites through discipline. The Jungian integrates them through insight. In both, the result is serenity. This serenity does not exclude emotion. It transforms it. Stoicism was often misunderstood as emotional numbness, but true Stoic peace is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of understanding. Likewise, Jung warned that detachment should not become disconnection. Emotions are the language of the unconscious. To repress them is to silence a part of the psyche. True peace includes emotion as music includes sound. It is the harmony of feeling and thought, instinct and reflection. The Stoic reason and Jungian self both represent order, not suppression, but integration of diverse energies into a unified whole. When the individual lives from that center, their emotions still arise, but they move through the psyche like wind through an open field, felt but never trapped. One of Jung's most important insights was that psychological stability arises from inner alignment with the self, not the ego. The ego, fragile and defensive, seeks peace through control, by arranging the outer world to match its preferences. But the self, the deeper organizing principle, finds peace through inclusion. It does not need to control because it recognizes that all opposites already belong to the whole. The Stoics understood this as the logos, the rational order underlying all things. To trust the logos is to rest in the conviction that everything happens according to universal reason. To trust the self is to rest in the conviction that every experience contributes to individuation. In both cases, trust replaces anxiety. The mind no longer fights reality, it cooperates with it. To cultivate this mindset, one must practice constant presence. Marcus Aurelius urged himself to confine yourself to the present. Jung saw the present as the meeting point between conscious and unconscious, the only place transformation occurs. Anxiety lives in the future, regret lives in the past. Peace lives only now. The Stoic discipline of focusing on the present moment is identical to the Jungian practice of awareness. Both train the mind to observe without judgment. When you attend to the present fully, you see that most of what disturbs you exists only in imagination. The past is memory, the future is projection. The psyche becomes still when it ceases to wander between them. Presence is not escape from time but reconciliation with it. Another crucial dimension of unshakable peace is meaning. The Stoics believed that humans suffer not from events but from meaningless suffering. They taught that every event is part of divine providence, that the universe is intelligent and purposeful. Jung echoed this through his concept of synchronicity and the meaningful order of the unconscious. He observed that when individuals align with their inner purpose, even pain acquires significance. Chaos becomes symbolic. Suffering ceases to be random. It becomes communication. This realization transforms despair into participation. You no longer see yourself as a victim of life, but as a co-creator within it. The Stoic calls this acceptance of fate. Jung calls it conscious participation in the self. Both see meaning as the bridge between chaos and peace. Peace also requires withdrawal of projection. Jung insisted that we reclaim from the outer world what truly belongs to us. As long as we project our fears, desires, and shadow onto others, we remain at war with the world. Every insult becomes personal, every disagreement a threat. The Stoics would say that we mistake opinions for facts, giving others power over our emotions. The withdrawal of projection is therefore the essence of freedom. When you no longer demand that others behave a certain way to maintain your peace, you discover that your peace was never theirs to protect. Jung described this as integration. The Stoics described it as autonomy of judgment. It is the point where the inner life becomes self-sustaining. To reach unshakable peace, one must also cultivate cosmic perspective. The Stoics practiced view from above, imagining oneself from a higher vantage, seeing human life as a small part of the vast cosmos. Jung's equivalent was the archetypal perspective, understanding personal experiences as expressions of universal patterns. Both dissolve the tyranny of the personal. When viewed from the cosmic or archetypal level, individual insults or setbacks lose their intensity. They become part of a larger narrative of growth. Marcus Aurelius reflected on how quickly generations vanish into time. Jung contemplated the eternal psyche that transcends individual life. This perspective does not diminish the personal but situates it within meaning. Peace follows naturally from proportion. An unshakable mind also rests on discipline of attention. The Stoics knew that the mind left untrained becomes the source of its own misery. They practiced vigilance over thought, guarding against irrational judgments. Jung taught the same vigilance, inwardly observing dreams, impulses, and fantasies with objectivity. Both require an active consciousness that refuses to be swept away by unconscious currents. Attention in this sense is not effort, but clarity. The Stoic focuses reason like a blade. The Jungian shines awareness like a light, both cut through illusion. The disciplined mind no longer reacts automatically, it responds from understanding. This inner governance is the true sovereignty of the self. Jung often said that peace is not found by escaping conflict but by transcending it. The Stoic Jungian mindset is not naive optimism but mature reconciliation. It accepts contradiction as natural. In a chaotic world, events will always fluctuate between order and disorder, gain and loss, praise and blame. The unintegrated mind rides these waves helplessly. The integrated mind floats above them. This does not mean detachment from reality, but participation from a higher level of consciousness. Jung called this the transcendent function. The Stoics called it living according to reason. In both, peace is the byproduct of understanding that opposites are necessary for harmony, as night balances day and death gives meaning to life. One of the most subtle yet powerful aspects of this mindset is non-resistance. Resistance multiplies suffering. The Stoics taught that when you resist what is, you suffer twice, once from the event and once from your refusal to accept it. Jung saw resistance as the ego's fear of losing control to the unconscious. But what the ego fears as dissolution is actually integration. Non-resistance is the realization that life's flow, though unpredictable, is intelligent. The moment you stop insisting that reality conform to your desires, your energy returns to you. Peace appears not because the world changes, but because your attitude toward it does. The Stoics expressed this through amor fati, love of fate. Jung expressed it through individuation, the acceptance of your destiny as the path of your soul. Unshakable peace also involves reconciliation with mortality. The Stoics practiced memento mori, remembering death not to breed fear but clarity. Death renders all trivial anxieties meaningless. Jung viewed death as the completion of the individuation process, the psyche's return to the collective source. To live peacefully is to live with awareness of impermanence. The ego resists this truth, seeking immortality through possessions, legacy, or identity. But the self knows that life and death are continuous. When you accept this, every moment becomes sufficient. You cease grasping at permanence, because you see that consciousness itself is eternal in form, if not in individuality. This awareness dissolves existential anxiety. What remains is stillness, not emptiness, but fullness beyond desire. The Stoic Jungian synthesis reveals that peace is not achieved by denial of the world, but by integration of self. The world's chaos mirrors the psyche's complexity. When the inner order is established, the outer disorder loses its sting. Jung described the self as a mandala, a symbol of wholeness where all elements find their place. The Stoic described virtue as harmony with the cosmic order. Both images point to symmetry, balance, and centeredness. When consciousness becomes a mandala, every emotion, thought, and event takes its rightful position. Nothing is excluded, nothing dominates. From that center, peace radiates naturally, not as an achievement, but as the natural state of alignment. It is important to recognize that such peace does not eliminate pain. Even the wisest human will feel loss, grief, or frustration. What changes is the relationship to these experiences. The Stoic bears them with dignity, seeing them as the cost of existence. The Jungian integrates them as part of individuation. The mature psyche no longer asks, "Why is this happening to me?" but "What is this revealing about the whole?" This shift from complaint to contemplation transforms suffering into meaning. Pain becomes revelation. Chaos becomes symbol. The individual becomes transparent to life, allowing experience to pass through without distortion. That transparency is serenity. In the end, the unshakable mind is not separate from the world, but united with it. The Stoic sees themselves as a citizen of the cosmos. The Jungian sees themselves as an expression of the collective unconscious. Both dissolve the illusion of isolation. Fear and anger fade when you no longer feel separate from the totality. The Stoic says, "What benefits the hive benefits the bee." Jung says, "The self is both individual and universal." Peace comes from this realization of participation, that your consciousness is a microcosm of the cosmic order. When you live from that awareness, even chaos becomes an expression of harmony you cannot yet see. Unshakable peace, therefore, is not an attainment, but a recognition. It is the awareness that beneath the surface of constant change there is an enduring stillness within nature, within the psyche, within the structure of existence itself. The Stoics called it logos. Jung called it the self. When the ego aligns with it, disturbance ceases. When reason and the unconscious harmonize, tranquility becomes the natural rhythm of being. The chaotic world remains what it is, but within there is silence, the silence of one who has understood. In a world that thrives on reaction, staying calm is the rarest form of intelligence. Stoicism teaches discipline, Jung teaches integration, and together they reveal that peace isn't a destination, it's a transformation. When you stop fighting life and start understanding it, the world no longer controls you. Remember this: what disturbs you reveals what you haven't yet mastered within. Thank you for watching, and if this message resonated, share it with someone who's ready to master their mind.